Hello everybody, Thersites the Historian here. Welcome back to part 3 of my ongoing series on why George W. Bush is one of the worst presidents in American history and why he should never be rehabilitated for any purpose at any time. Today, I'd like to take a look at George W. Bush's origins. Recently, when Trump was inaugurated, Bush had a famous fight with a poncho which he seemingly lost. And while this may appear to be an insignificant but somewhat amusing incident, the fact is that it forms a perfect metaphor for George W. Bush's life. The battle with the poncho was completely insignificant. It had no lasting ramifications, and the struggle wasn't really that meaningful. And you could say much the same thing about the entirety of George W. Bush's life all the way up until 1994 when he ran for governor of Texas. So today I'd like to take a look at the youth of George W. Bush, his early years, his education, his controversial military service, and everything that made him into the man who became Texas governor and then President of the United States. So let's take a look at the origin story of George W. Bush. Because the Bush family is so well known, I see no need to go into the personal details of his life. I'd rather like to look at his resume. So let's start out with Bush's educational background. In high school, he went to a place called Phillips Academy, which was a boarding high school, and he rose to be the head cheerleader, which, of course, is the highest honor that any high schooler could ever hope to attain. He went to Yale University later and earned his BA in history, which I think is pretty cool. I have a BA in history too. He graduated in 1968. He was a cheerleader once again, a frat guy. He practiced rugby, and his grades were kind of mediocre. Maybe not quite as bad as some people have made out, but he was pretty much a C or C plus student, so nothing to write home about. Later, after his controversial military service was completed, or signed off on, or whatever the case might be, he attended Harvard Business School from 1973 to 1975, and he earned an MBA, becoming the only American president ever with an MBA, which explains why he was so much better at handling the economy than any previous president. I would also like to point out that he didn't really have the best grades in high school either, so you might be a little suspicious that he got into Yale because of family connections. His dad was an alumnus, and the same is true of his entry into Harvard Business School. It was not because of his academic brilliance, but rather the connections that the man had. During the late 60s and early 70s, America brought back the draft in order to have enough manpower to both maintain all of our various bases around the world and to fight the completely pointless war in Vietnam. Like many young men, George W. Bush was called up by this draft, and like most of those who had connections, or at least a considerable number of those who had connections, he was able to pull some strings to get himself out of harm's way. He managed to get into the Texas Air National Guard. And the good thing about that, the desirability of such a posting, is that an Air National Guard is a lot less likely to be deployed to combat than an active duty unit. So, Bush's deal was that he would serve for a longer period of time, but most likely be kept stateside. So it's a pretty good deal for him. Unfortunately, of course, millions of Americans who did get drafted did not have similar recourse. He was assigned to fly the F-102 Delta Dagger. By this point, this plane is a bit older. It had been replaced by an F-106 Delta Dart, which was faster, basically the same plane, just better. And, of course, the reason why he's flying an older design is because he was in the Air National Guard rather than the active duty Air Force. And despite that, though, normally if you're going to be put as a pilot of a fighter craft, you have to test really well. But Bush's test scores were pretty low. Apparently he was at the 25th percentile or something when he took his pre-flight test. And he also had a couple of arrests on his record from his Yale days. As I mentioned, or at least alluded to, he liked the party back then. So the way he got into flight school was a bit suspect to begin with, but again, nothing super unusual. This was not uncommon for rich kids. And then, of course, he never deployed out of the U.S., and what we have of his service record, there are parts that have been removed because either they were embarrassing or who knows. But anyway, we do know that he struggled mightily with flight tests and landings, and they had a lot of trouble finding people who could account for his whereabouts or people who served with him. And this became a major issue during the 2004 campaign. So, this is sort of a black mark on his record, and it's really surprising how long it took to catch up with them. It only really bit him in the ass in 2004, but of course, he famously was able to evade having to face this issue by impugning John Kerry's character and his conduct when he actually did go to Vietnam, despite the fact that he too had sufficient connections to not go. So, now that he was free from his military obligations and he had attended Harvard Business School, what type of business would George W. Bush go into? Well, as a Texas cowboy who came by way of Connecticut, George W. Bush decided to go into the most Texan of all fields, oil exploitation. So, he started his own oil company in 1977. It was then merged with another oil company, and then that new company was bought by a third company. And over the course of that 12-year period, George W. Bush really struggled. He didn't really know how to find oil or make money off of it, and there was also a drop in oil prices at one point, which, didn't help either. So it wasn't really a very impressive performance, but it wasn't a complete and total disaster. At any rate, you would expect a little more out of someone who had a famous name, so he could make connections very easily, and he, in theory, would have the best training available as a Harvard MBA. Later, when his oil company was bought out by HKN, he was investigated for insider trading, but he was cleared because there wasn't sufficient evidence that he was engaging in insider trading. And after the merger was completed, he joined the board of directors for HKN. Later on, he decided that oil was kind of boring or whatever, and he started an investment group to buy the Texas Rangers. And I believe he contributed about $500,000 or so of his own dollars. He didn't contribute all that much in the grand scheme, but because he had put the group together, he got to manage the team. So from 1989 until 1994, his primary occupation was the deadly serious business of minor league baseball. So there's no telling how many local Texans had their lives improved immeasurably by the management decisions of George W. Bush and his draft picks, coaching hires, and all that kind of stuff. It's really hard to gauge what kind of a positive impact that had on the world, but it's very clear that it must have been immense. And then in 1998, while still governor of Texas, George W. Bush finally sold all of his shares in the team and made quite a bit of money. So I guess that was his greatest success, was selling a team and while governor, by the way, so conducting private business while governor, and no doubt benefiting from the fact that as governor he could distribute favors, and he was also a rising star on the national political scene by this point. So everything was clearly above board and not suspect at all. Far from being just a mediocre businessman, George W. Bush also had a wealth of political experience going into his 1994 bid for governor. He had helped moderate Republican Winton Blount in his failed 1972 Senate bid. And actually I looked into this, and Winton Blount was actually not a bad guy. Apparently he was a Mississippi senator who worked with Lyndon Johnson and with Nixon in order to make sure that civil rights were implemented and enforced. So far as Republicans go, he defies what your expectations would be for a Deep South Republican at this period. So at least Bush was aligning himself with Republicans who weren't totally terrible. Then, back in Texas, presumably as his oil business was starting to flounder a bit, Bush decided to run for an open seat in the 19th House District. What had happened is there had been a Democratic incumbent who had retired. He had held the seat since 1935, and Bush thought that this was a good chance. And then he ran in this district, which is in rural Texas, and you might think, well, hey, a Republican could do pretty well there. The thing is, though, his opponent, the Democrat, painted Bush as out of touch with rural Texans and managed to win by 6 points. Keep in mind also that the South was called the Solid South, until the start of the 70s. So there were still a lot of rural Democrats around, even if the South was in flux this time. 1978, also, by the way, is the year that Newt Gingrich broke into politics by winning an upset victory in Georgia. Bush's other political experience consisted of working on his father's 1988 and 1992 presidential bids. It's pretty clear that he didn't do a whole hell of a lot. He went to some rallies, spoke here or there, and possibly made coffee or something else of that nature. The most politically significant thing that he did prior to holding the Texas governorship was, without a doubt, being his father's bagman when it came to firing the White House Chief of Staff, John Sununu. If you look at George W. Bush's resume going into 1994, there was not a single item that would make him seem like gubernatorial material. Nothing that he had ever done was worthy of a governorship of a major state. However, he did have one asset that none of his opponents had, and that was a famous family name. If we look at the history of the Bush family, his grandfather, Prescott Bush, was a wealthy, successful, and well-known businessman who then became a senator for a decade. His father, George H.W. Bush, was a congressman, CIA director, vice president under Reagan, and then a one-term president from 88 to 92. And Bush, because of his involvement with his father and that association, combined with his business activities in Texas, had countless corporate connections, especially among oil executives, so he could always count on being able to raise a lot of money. He had Southern connections in the post-Nixon world, and he also had New England connections with moderate Republicans. And why do I bring that up? Because we're only talking about Texas. Well, the people who were backing him were thinking a little more broadly. You see, at the same time, Jeb Bush was running for governor of Florida, also in 1994. He didn't win, but two Bush brothers were running in two different large states. That's not a coincidence. It's very clear that the Republican establishment at the time wanted to capitalize on Bush name recognition to create a future political juggernaut. And it turns out that this Bush was the one who was successful in 1994 and would then carry the torch for the party. Of course, later, famously, they tried to do the same thing with Jeb, and didn't quite work out as well. But unfortunately, they did manage to get Bush elected as governor of Texas, and then he was able to use that platform to ruin the entire country.